Here's Ben Shapiro to whine about the fact that the government treats gay couples as legally the same as straight couples.
Well, it was a historic day at the White House as Joe Biden signed what the Washington Post is calling a landmark bill to protect same-sex and interracial marriages. Now, you thought that interracial marriage has not been a big deal in the United States for approximately 50, maybe 60 years, and you'd be right. The whole purpose of shoving interracial marriage into the same-sex marriage bill was to pretend that if you oppose same-sex marriage, it is the same thing as if you oppose interracial marriage, that racism and quote-unquote homophobia, that these are all the same phenomenon, that really it's all about bigotry and evil. That's the reason why they shoved all of this into the same bill, so that if you voted against the federal enshrinement of same-sex marriage, then you were also voting against federal enshrinement of interracial marriage, right? It's a particularly vicious and stupid game.
Well, the court cases that deemed laws against gay marriage and laws against interracial marriage as unconstitutional have something important in common, namely that Obergefell v. Hodges, the case that legalized gay marriage, and Loving v. Virginia, the case that legalized interracial marriage, were based on the Due Process Clause. Loving was also based on the Equal Protection Clause, but regardless, since some justices on the Supreme Court have signaled that they don't think the Due Process Clause should be interpreted in the way that it was interpreted in those cases, the basis for Loving will be compromised while the case for Obergefell will be completely undone if the Supreme Court gets a chance to rule on those issues again. That's the important bit that the two issues have in common.
President Biden on Tuesday afternoon signed the Respect for Marriage Act into law, according to the Washington Post, granting federal protections to same-sex and interracial couples, marking a milestone in the decades-long fight for marriage equality. And so I think that it's important to note here that what we saw yesterday at the White House is the beginning. It is not the end. Everybody who's pretending that this was the end point of the same-sex marriage movement, that the end point of the LGBTQ minus plus divided by sign movement is going to be same-sex marriage, is dead wrong. And Joe Biden said that out loud yesterday. And it is very clear that the goal here, the goalposts keep moving. They keep moving because in the end, what the LGBTQ plus minus divided by sign movement is about is not merely the idea that they should be able to live the lives that they want without being bothered in the privacy of their own homes. The idea is that the ideology that undergirds their belief system must be imposed on you.
You make it sound like Joe Biden is going to force me to marry a dude. I suspect that what you really mean is that people might not be allowed to treat gay couples like pariahs.
You as a religious person in your daily life, you in your schools, you in your churches, the notion that this is going to stop is just a lie. It is not true. And as proof, I would like to offer this clip of Joe Biden circa 2006, because the goalposts have moved. I've mentioned this before. The goalposts moved from the reasonable to the not reasonable to the insane. They moved from, we wish to lead our sexual lives as we want without you interfering in our bedroom. And Americans, for a very long time, said, that's fine.
No, they didn't. The last 10 states to have laws against even that much had to be dragged by the Supreme Court kicking and screaming into the 21st century.
Even sodomy laws, for example, that were on the books in many states were generally not enforced, even in the years well leading up to Lawrence v. Texas.
Oh, they were generally not enforced? How tolerant. How comforting it is to know that people were only occasionally charged for performing a BJ. Also, the principle of substantive due process, the same principle upon which Obergefell v. Hodges was decided, was also the principle upon which Lawrence v. Texas was decided. Any state that wants to bring back laws against even just doing it with another person of the same gender will be allowed to do so by the current Supreme Court. Can you really blame people for wanting some extra legislative protection from that?
So they said, just leave us alone. We don't want to be criminalized in terms of our private activity. Fine. Then it turned into, we just want civil unions so that if we are in a relationship with a member of the same sex, these people can visit us at the hospital and they can be in our wills just by nature of law. And many Americans are like, okay, that's totally fine. All right, makes sense. In fact, it was Mitt Romney in Massachusetts who was one of the first people to sign into law civil unions in the state of Massachusetts. Then it was, well, it's not enough for us to have them called civil unions. We want them to be called marriage. We want the same moral respect as a traditional marriage. And a lot of people say, well, hold up a second. This isn't the same phenomenon. And you can say a lot of things about same-sex relationships, but it is very difficult to claim they have the same societal value as traditional male-female dyads producing children.
But marriage isn't exclusive to male-female dyads producing children, is it? Marriages are not dissolved if they fail to produce children. Marriage is not forbidden to anyone on the grounds of being postmenopausal or otherwise infertile. The ability to procreate is not, and has never been, a necessary condition for marriage, certainly not in the United States. But even if the purpose of marriage were procreation, what harm is being done by granting the same recognition to infertile pairings?
Which is what the institution of marriage is predicated upon.
If that were the case, why would anyone postmenopausal bother to get married, or be allowed to get married? In fact, once the children are grown, what is the point of staying married if a necessary condition for the institution is the rearing of children?
The institution of marriage is just an enshrinement of the simple biological fact that men and women combine to create children and then raise those children. That is all that marriage is.
If that's all that marriage is, then would you advise infertile people not to bother? Would you go so far as to advise infertile people against getting married?
You can pretend that other forms of relationship are equivalent. You can pretend that other forms of relationship have similar societal value. They do not.
Why not? And even if they don't, why would they have to be deserving of marriage? Couples who can't have their own kids can still adopt and raise kids. Does that fact not grant such couples enough societal value to make them worthy of marriage? Sometimes same-sex couples end up raising kids produced from previous opposite-sex relationships. Would you prefer that those same-sex couples remain unmarried while they raise those kids? And even if we take kids out of the equation, do you think there is no societal value to people committing to one another and pooling their resources?
So a lot of people say, well, no, hold up just a minute. But the case that the left made on this was that marriage really isn't about the production of children.
Well, given that infertile people have never been forbidden to marry in America, it clearly has never been only about the production of children. And how could it be, given that you don't even need to be married to produce children?
It's really not about creating family units.
A married couple is a family unit, regardless of whether they have children.
Marriage is just about who you love. And once they had redefined that, and they'd actually done this well in advance of same-sex marriage. They'd done this with regard to, for example, no-fault divorce. The idea being that there wasn't anything sacred about marriage. There wasn't anything unifying or creative of a family unit about marriage. It was just about who you loved. So if you didn't love somebody, then divorce was totally on the table. So no-fault divorce is fine.
I guess Ben believes that no-fault divorces are not fine, but miserable, loveless marriages that people are not allowed to dissolve unless they become outright abusive are A-okay.
Once marriage had been redefined as just love between two individual human beings, then of course same-sex marriage fell under that rubric. So many Americans were like, even there, they were like, okay. And then it moved to, well, now, if you are a person who doesn't actually believe that same-sex marriage and traditional marriage are morally equivalent, you still must celebrate same-sex marriage in every aspect of your life.
That's right, Ben. You have to celebrate it in every aspect of your life. You have to eat a gay wedding cake at every meal.
It's very important that you do so. And your kids must be taught about this stuff at the earliest possible age.
What would be the problem with them learning about gay marriage at the same age at which they learn about any other kind of marriage? Even at daycare or kindergarten, they might meet another kid who has two moms or two dads. Should the kids whose parents are of the same gender be forbidden to mention that fact to the other children?
When your kids go to school, they must learn that same-sex marriage and traditional marriage are exactly the same, that all forms of sexual activity are equivalently moral and decent and fulfilling and good.
Don't you think that's a little bit of a leap? You can let kids know that sometimes dudes marry dudes without telling them anything about what people do in their bedrooms.
Okay, that's how far the ball has moved. And it's moved really far, really fast. And this is why I say that when the left says we got what we wanted here, they're lying. They're lying. When they said same-sex marriage was the end point, it is not the end point. It is the beginning point. Here is Joe Biden circa 2006 talking about why there was no necessity for a constitutional amendment to protect traditional marriage. He says there's no real reason for this sort of thing. The reason, why would we need a constitutional amendment to protect traditional marriage?
Because legally recognizing same-sex marriage does no harm whatsoever to traditional marriage. You can still get traditionally married. You are as free to engage in traditional marriage as you ever were. There is no need to protect traditional marriage because same-sex marriage does no harm to traditional marriage whatsoever.
As the definition of marriage in federal law, after all, who would be pushing such a thing? Who would be pushing the idea of redefining marriage? Here's Joe Biden, 2006. Tucker Carlson showed this clip last night.
The world's going to Hades in a handbasket, We are desperately concerned about the circumstance relating to avian flu. We don't have enough vaccines. We don't have enough police officers. And we're going to debate the next 3 weeks, I'm told, gay marriage, a flag amendment, and God only knows what else. I can't believe the American people can't see through this. We already have a law, the Defense of Marriage Act, where we've all voted, where I voted and others said, look, marriage is between a man and a woman, and states must respect that. Nobody's violated that law. There's been no challenge to that law. Why do we need a constitutional amendment? Marriage is between a man and a woman.
That was Joe Biden in 2006. It is now 2022. 16 years is not all that long a time. And now Joe Biden is on the lawn at the White House celebrating same-sex marriage being enshrined into federal law.
Ben's really mad about Biden changing his mind for the better.
Without proper protections for people who disagree that same-sex marriage is on the same moral par as traditional marriage.
Won't somebody please think of the bigots? We must protect the bigots.
I mean, it's pretty amazing stuff, is it not? And it suggests that when people like Joe Biden say in 2006 that same-sex marriage is not on the table, they are lying to you. They are not telling you the truth. And when they deny outright that, for example, that when they say, we're not coming after your religious community, we're not coming after your church, we're not coming after your religious school, we're not coming after your business, they're lying.
What do you mean by coming after, exactly? The law that Biden signed says that, consistent with the First Amendment to the Constitution, nonprofit religious organizations, including churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, non-denominational ministries, interdenominational and ecumenical organizations, mission organizations, faith-based social agencies, religious educational institutions, and nonprofit entities whose principal purpose is the study, practice, or advancement of religion, and any employee of such an organization shall not be required to provide services, accommodations, advantages, facilities, goods, or privileges for the solemnization or celebration of a marriage. By writing this into law, they are not just saying that they won't force religious institutions to recognize same-sex marriages, they are making it illegal to do so. Now you might point out that, as Biden said in that clip, the same was true of the Defense of Marriage Act, but that act was overturned by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court that is going to be in place for the next generation or so is not going to overturn this provision of the law. Ben complained that there were no protections for people who disagree that same-sex marriage is on the same moral par as traditional marriage, but this law contains explicit protections for such irrational and hateful prejudices.
It's not true. So yesterday, on the lawn of the White House, Joe Biden declared that today was it was a great day. Here was Joe Biden. He's wearing his aviator shades, which means that he's in a good mood, according to the press. It means that he's winning, according to the press. Here was Joe Biden yesterday.
Today's a good day. A day America takes a vital step toward equality, toward liberty and justice, not just for some, but for everyone. Everyone.
Hey, notice, a vital step toward equality. Right, it's a step. So what does equality actually look like in Joe Biden's view? In Joe Biden's view, what equality actually looks like is the transing of the children, for example. This is something he actively talked about in his speech.
Ben thinks that people aren't just trans. No, in order to be trans, someone has to subject you to transing. A child can't be trans unless a woke SJW bites them during a full moon or something.
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.